Bismillah. First, I'd like to apologize for being late, but it looks like we're okay there. But one thing I will say that I learned is that 4800 South Saginaw is quite unlike 4800 North Saginaw. First, I'd like to thank Professor Chris Hoffey and the other organizers for convening this important conference. And I think, and the second thing I'd like to say is a disclaimer, and that is that the topic of ensoulment is not my specialty, but I hope that the subject of this brief presentation will generate worthwhile discussion. Is the audio okay? Okay. I think I speak naturally, I project naturally, so I'll move this a bit away. Okay, let's jump right into it. We read in the Quran that when the human being was in the womb, God breathed from His soul, ruh, into the human. This breathing, this insufflation, was the moment of ensoulment, the moment when the fetus or embryo, as we'll see, acquired, if you will, its soul, its ruh. And I suspect we'll discover later today that soul is not the best definition for ruh, but I'll use it for now for the sake of convenience. As we shall see, Muslim scholars disagree over when exactly ensoulment occurs. And this is a disagreement with profound practical implications, especially in the context of the abortion debate. Now, the Quran never explicitly indicates when exactly ensoulment occurs, but it does present a sequence of developments. We read in Surah 39, for example, verse 6, God creates you in your mother's wombs in one stage after another, in threefold depths of darkness. In Surah 23 we read, we created the human from an essence of clay, then we placed the human as a drop of fluid, a nutfa, in a safe place, then we made that drop into a clinging form, a alaqa, which is also defined sometimes as a blood clot. And we made that form into a lump of flesh, a mudgha, which is also defined as something that appears to be chewed. And we made that lump into bones, and we clothed those bones with flesh, and later we made the human into other forms. In Surah 22, verse 5, we read, we created you from dust, then a drop of fluid, a nutfa, then a clinging form, a alaqa, then a lump of flesh, a mudgha, both shaped and unshaped. We mean to make our power clear to you. Whatever we will to be born, we cause to remain in the wombs for an appointed time. Then we bring you forth as infants. In Surah 32, verses 8 through 9, and this is perhaps the most interesting or most relevant passage, we find out that here God created the human, quote, from an extract of a humble fluid. Then, thumma, that's how we're translating thumma here, God molded the human, and God breathed from His soul, His ruh, into the human, and God gave you hearing, sight, and minds. So here's what we have. We see that there is a progression here. Drop of fluid, a nutfa, to a clinging form, alaqa, to a lump of flesh, mudgha, and at some point, ensoulment. And as we'll see, the majority holds that ensoulment occurs at the end, after the mudgha stage. As is often the case, the hadith corpus offers more details. And here I shall focus on the tradition with which I'm most familiar, the Sunni tradition, although I should note that there is much overlap with the Shi'i tradition. In the two most well-known hadith collections, the Sahihain of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, we encounter important details not found, incidentally, in many other important hadith collections and other related works, including the Muwatta of Malik. Here is one of the most well-known hadiths, one that is cited by both, that is recorded by both Al-Bukhari and Muslim, as well as An-Nawawi in his famous 40 hadith collection. This hadith is narrated by the Prophet's companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and here is one version of the hadith, and there are variants that are fairly similar. We read, God's apostle, the truthful and truly inspired, said, "The human being is put together in the womb of his mother for 40 days, and then turns into a clinging form, a alaqa, for a similar period." And this is the translation, the common translation of the Arabic, mithla dhalika. And then turns into a piece of flesh for a similar period, mithla dhalika. And then God sends an angel and orders him to write 4 things: his deeds, his livelihood, the date of his death, and whether he will be of the wretched or the blessed in the hereafter. Then the soul is breathed into him. And so, as I note here, you have variants of this hadith recorded by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. So, the notion that, so here's what we have. We have stage 1, we have the nutfa stage, and according to the dominant interpretation, it takes 40 days. It lasts 40 days. And then the alaqa stage also lasts 40 days, mudgha stage, 40 days, and then the insufflation. That's when the ensoulment occurs, so on or around day 120. The notion that ensoulment occurs at day 120 is undoubtedly the majority view among Muslim scholars past and present. And this view affects the discourse on abortion. If we survey Sunni madhabs, their positions on abortion, we see that abortion after day 120 is generally forbidden among all 4 Sunni madhabs, even in the cases of rape and incest. Although unborn, the fetus, particularly after ensoulment, is a human being and should be respected as such. As we read in Sahih al-Bukhari, there was an incident where a woman hit a pregnant woman in the abdomen with a stone, and in the process killed the fetus, presumably after the period of ensoulment. The Prophet, peace be upon him, demanded blood money despite objections by the offender, who is quoted as saying, "How can I be fined for killing one who neither ate nor drank, neither spoke nor cried?" But while the ulama generally agree that the fetus after day 120 has a soul, some hold that ensoulment occurs earlier than this. And we see this affecting the abortion discourse. In the Hanafi madhab, where we find much diversity, in fact, it's the most diverse madhab on this issue, we find many ulama arguing that abortion before day 120 is permissible even if it is makruh or disliked. Some Hanafis, however, argue that abortions could not be performed or should not be performed after day 40. The Malikis, who tend to be on the conservative side in the abortion debate, generally prohibit all abortions after day 40, not 120. And some actually say day 1. Incidentally, the Malikis were unusual in that they generally did not permit abortions in cases where the mother's well-being was at risk. This was unusual among the other madhabs, Why would certain Hanafis and many Malikis prohibit abortion after day 40? In some cases, it is assumed that once the alaqa stage obtains, we have what's called takhalluq, a divinely ordained path toward the creation of a human being. So to disrupt this divinely ordained path would be impermissible. That's one reason for the 40-day position. But there is in fact another reason some scholars prohibit abortion after day 40. And this is because some scholars, a few medieval scholars, and a significant number of modern scholars hold that ensoulment occurs at or around day 40. Let's go back to the hadith we saw earlier. In most, not all, but most versions of this hadith, the number 40 appears only once. Okay, now there is one version of the hadith where it actually says the alaqa stage is 40 days, the lutfa stage is, alaqa stage is 40 days, the mudgha stage is 40 days. There is one variant of the hadith where 40 is mentioned 3 times. But in most versions of the hadith, 40 only appears once at the beginning. Now, The expression that I have translated as for a similar period is in Arabic مثل ذلك, which literally means like that. A minority of scholars hold that this hadith should be reinterpreted so that all of the developments mentioned here, the nutfa stage, alaqa stage, and mudgha stage, that they all occur during the first 40-day period. One reason some would advocate this interpretation is that the hadith continues and by noting that after the mudgha stage, an angel comes to what we would call an embryo and determines the four things. So let's keep this angel in mind. In another hadith, also recorded by Muslim, Hudhayfa ibn Usayd relates the following. He reported directly from God's messenger, peace be upon him, that he said, "The angel is sent to the nutfa, the drop of fluid, after it has settled in the uterus for 40 or 45 nights, and says, 'Lord, is it to be wretched or happy?' Then this is inscribed. Then he says, 'Lord, is it to be male or female?' Then this is inscribed, together with its deeds, its progeny, its term of life, and its sustenance. Then the records are folded up, and nothing more is added nor subtracted." And you have similar variants recorded by Muslim. So if we accept both hadiths and assume that ensoulment occurs at day 120, this would mean that an angel records our deeds and lifespan on two separate occasions, day 40 or so, and you have variants that will say day 40 or 42 or 45, or day 120. This interpretation would be difficult to defend when you consider the wording of this particular hadith. Again, look at that last line. Then the records are folded up and nothing more is added nor subtracted. It would seem that something here has to give. Further support for the 40-day interpretation can be found in other hadiths recorded by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. Consider the following example from Al-Bukhari. Anas ibn Malik reports that the Prophet said, "At every womb, God appoints an angel who says, 'O Lord, a nutfa, O Lord, a alaqa, O Lord, a mudgha.' Then, if God wishes to complete its creation, the angel asks, 'Will it be male or female, wretched or blessed? How much will his provision be, and what will his age be?' All this is written while the child or embryo is still in the mother's womb." Notice that the angel records whether the embryo is to be a male or a female after the mudgha stage. According to the previous hadith, gender is designated around day 40 or 42 or 45. Is that clear? I hope we're not a lot of numbers here. Okay. In addition, we read the following in Sahih Muslim. Hudhayfa reports that the Prophet said, "There is an angel who looks after the womb when God decides to create anything after more than 40 nights are over." Notice again that the angel is assigned to the embryo around day 40 and then watches over it, suggesting that day 40 initiates a new and important stage in the development of the embryo. Additional support for the 40-day interpretation comes from the people of the book, specifically certain Jews. Although some Jews, and certainly many Christians, believe that ensoulment occurs at conception, a great many Jews hold that it occurs around day 40. This position is arguably grounded in the Talmud, specifically passages that you see here, cited here, that claim that an embryo less than 40 days old is, quote, unformed. And you see that this affects the law as well. If something happens to the baby before, or to the embryo before day 40, there are different consequences there in the law. Interestingly, the notion that ensoulment occurs around day 40 was even espoused by Aristotle. But Aristotle made a distinction between males and females, claiming that ensoulment occurred at day 40 for males and day 90 for females. As you may recall, when referring to advocates of the 40-day position within Islam, I noted that they comprised a few medieval scholars and a significant number of modern scholars. Why would the 40-day position be more popular among modern Muslim scholars? The answer, or at least one important answer, is science. In recent decades, writers of various backgrounds have asserted that there are scientific miracles in the Quran, from Maurice Bucaille to Harun Yahya to Khalil al-Naggar. Numerous popular writers have drawn attention to the Quranic description of embryonic development. They highlight, for instance, the fact that the Quran refers to the embryo as a mudgha, a lump of flesh or something that is like that which is chewed. And indeed, at one point during the development of the embryo looks like it has teeth marks. This image comes from the Brief Illustrated Guide to Islam, a widely distributed dawah booklet. Again, this is the mudgha stage, the last stage before ensoulment. Well, this stage of fetal development, as we know, if you look at the image that's being used here, this stage begins and ends before day 40. And by day 40, I mean 40 days after fertilization, or after conception. As you may recall, the dominant view historically has been the following, that the mudgha stage occurs between days 80 and 120, which is then followed by ensoulment. To claim that the mudgha stage occurs between days 80 and 120, which is then followed by ensoulment, excuse me, let me try that again. To claim that the mudgha stage occurs later is to give up on the modern mudgha miracle claim. Recognizing this, many of the writers who speak of scientific miracles, like Khalil al-Naggar, assert that ensoulment occurs around day 40 or 42, and that the Quran is completely in line with modern science. This, of course, raises an important epistemological or methodological question, and that is, should one grant authority to modern science when interpreting the Quran and Hadith corpus? And if authority is granted to modern science, what is one to make of the fact that science is an evolving field? And speaking of evolution, one cannot help but notice that many, not all, but many, of the writers who speak of scientific miracles in the Quran tend to reject ideas that most modern scientists take for granted, like Darwinian evolution, not to mention the notion that humans do not have souls in the first place. And so there's an apparent inconsistency in this contemporary appeal to science. One, of course, need not accept everything that the scientific community promulgates. But where exactly does one draw the line? This is a topic we might want to take up during the discussion. In the case of ensoulment, modern science may not lead one directly to the minority 40-day position, but again, it certainly gives one an additional nudge in that direction. But if one turns to modern science to defend the 40-day position, again, consistency becomes an issue. And this means that one will need to address some lingering questions. For example, the aforementioned hadiths state that the gender of the embryo is determined around day 40. How could this be in line with science is not gender determined at conception? Here, of course, one could argue that genes are only part of the equation, and that, in fact, various organs are differentiated around day 40, and this is true. In any case, my point here is simply that if one is to recognize a scientific component when engaging in exegesis, one has to take that scientific component seriously. Finally, I'd like to highlight the profound implications of this discourse, especially if we consider the related discourse on abortion. Here, you see, in stark contrast, the difference between a fetus at around day 120, at or around day 120, and an embryo at or around day 40. I mean, notice one is called a fetus, one is an embryo, so they're different categories. If one holds that ensoulment occurs at day 120, then one would be more likely, again, all I'm saying here is more likely, to support a pro-choice political agenda. If one holds that ensoulment occurs at day 40, then one would be more likely to oppose a pro-choice agenda. And in the latter case, one might think that a great many aborted fetuses were in fact murdered. And so the effect of appealing to modern science and arguing for the 40-day position is, interestingly, a step toward conservative politics. Again, the implications are hardly insignificant. And I'll end there. Thank you. Okay, so should we begin with questions and then have a discussion? Okay, let's open the floor for questions first. Yes, Dr. Aftab.
I have a question regarding I think you made an excellent point on interpretation of science and how we should use it with regard to hadith literature. But on the hadith that you mentioned, there's the stages of embryonic development, and then the last line has to do with, as you say, the insufflation of the soul. And as you describe it, it sounds like almost a medical concept where the fetus is insufflated with the soul. Do we have to use this scientific? Do we have to take it as a scientific concept literally at this point, or can this also be interpreted metaphorically?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the Quran itself tells the Prophet to lower his wings to the believers. He obviously didn't have wings, right? But there's something. So there's a different level of meaning there. So one could certainly read the hadith that way. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, can you say a little bit more about what exactly the scientific evidence for the 40-day period is?
Yeah. Well, so the big issue is that people want to say that the Quran is accurately describing embryonic development. Okay. It's referring to the alaqa, refers to the mudgha. Well, all of these things, they occur, if you look at what people are pointing to, they're all occurring within the first 40 days. Okay. So if you say, if I can go back to this slide here, if we look at the majority view historically, it would be a problem to say, look, the Quran it accurately describes the mudgha stage when you're claiming that that's between days 80 and 120. Because what people are, between days 80 and 120, you have, it doesn't look like a mudgha, it would seem.
Well, that seems like one option. The other option seems like it would be you're misidentifying the mudgha stage.
Absolutely.
That you would hold the priority of Quran fixed.
Yes.
And the priority of this hadith.
Absolutely.
So that's why I'm wondering what exactly the scientific.
Right. I mean, this is what has become popularized as the image of mudgha. This if you go online and you type in, by the way, I found out, if you go to Google Images, don't just type in mudgha, type in something else, or else you'll get some model and it becomes really bad. But just type in mudgha and Islam and embryos and so on, and you will see this image. This is like the standard image you see in dawah materials, in writings of various Muslim writers. Maurice Bucaille spoke of this decades ago. So this is what's become popular. I'm not supporting it. I'm just explaining what's become popularized as the image of mudgha. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think, how.
But is this the scientific evidence? This is what I'm asking.
This is what is claimed to be the scientific evidence. I'm with you. I don't think one has to be bound to this. But that is what is claimed to be the scientific evidence. Yeah.
Okay, so, go ahead.
Well, I'm trying to wrap myself around the philosophical position of, say, all the different scholars, backgrounds, historians, and thinkers, and so on. And what I'm hearing is that, like, look, there's a stage where there's a physical development of what a human being is, and then there's the spiritual side, which is the soul. And what the only argument is where along that that development stage, when do they get connected? So
exactly.
Is it fair enough to say that there's no other thing out there? Like, in other words, the only argument is when? Is that what you're?
That seems to be the big issue, right? When? I mean, of course, if you read like Muhammad Asad, for example, and other interpreters of the Quran, they won't be as bound to some of these, to this notion that, okay, there actually is a day when this happens. Even when the Quran refers to, in Surah Al-A'raf, I believe, when it refers to how everyone, prostrated to God before they were born. Historically, many assume that this is something that actually happened in the past, and we've forgotten it. Well, if you read like Muhammad Asad, for example, his interpretation, he would say, no, this is just, everybody goes through this, individually when you're born. It's a metaphorical thing. It's not that we actually were physically prostrating to God. So certainly when it comes to ensoulment, many will not think of it as, okay, this occurs on day, whatever. It's a process. And again, the Quran doesn't really get into numbers, doesn't mention the numbers. The Quran just gives a general description. And actually, if we're going to look at the Quranic description, if you look at this passage here, God created the human from an extract of a humble fluid. Here we have thumma, which is usually translated as then. Some translate it as moreover. God molded the human, and then you have and, which could be interpreted as and or then, because it's wa in Arabic. God breathed from His soul into the human, and or then, God gave you hearing, sight, and minds. And so even the language here, you could also, it's kind of open as far as, there's no sort of, even the progression of events. That's why I say here, at some point ensoulment, because the Quran doesn't really it's not explicit about when ensoulment occurs. It's in the hadith that you get the details, but again, and then of course there's the issue of authenticity, and there are variants of these same hadiths. I mean, the hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, there are several variants recorded by both Bukhari and Muslim. So you have variants of these hadiths. You don't find them in other sources, like you don't find that in the Muwatta, you don't find it in other sources. So I mean, these get complicated, obviously.
So just as a follow-up to that then, so in your readings then, so, regardless of when it happens,
yeah.
Let's say the fascinating controversy, there's still, lots of areas to look into that.
Yeah.
So then, what happens? So, okay, ensoulment occurs regardless when along that linear pathway.
Yeah.
Then is there, what exactly happens, other than to know these time frames and looking at the, the Quranic literature and the Sunnah and so on, is there any indication as to what exactly happens to then say, this is now the difference, that before
right.
this wasn't there, now it's there? That's
a great question. I mean, in the readings that I looked at, I didn't see anything that really dealt with that issue. The reason this comes up is because of the abortion debate. And the idea is that, okay, once this occurs, it's a whole new ballgame now. Even though, I mean, if you look at the reports of the Prophet, you don't really find, if a fetus is aborted or something happens, there is a kind of blood money that's paid, but there isn't discussion of, okay, well, was it before ensoulment or after ensoulment? There is no discussion of that. The only hadiths that people say, again, are these generally worded hadiths that say, okay, well, after 40 days and so on. But there's no hadith that I'm aware of where somebody loses a fetus or an embryo or the miscarriage, and the question is raised, okay, well, what stage did this happen? We don't get that discussion that I've come across, at least. So these are later scholars now taking the evidence they have and then saying, okay, well, yeah, at this point now, you cannot have an abortion. It would be haram, not makruh or whatever. It's haram at this point because now there's a soul. And they don't really get into what does that mean, there's a soul now. Other than, presumably they would now assume that, okay, it has some kind of awareness, some kind of consciousness. Presumably that would be the difference.
So at this point, we have really, really detailed knowledge of embryonic development, not just for humans, but populous species. So day-to-day sort of knowledge,
yeah.
Right? So has anybody tried to just look at, each day, or, each 40-day period
yeah.
and sort of try to interpret, what's
right.
said here?
Like a new interpretation of mudgha. Yeah, let me go back to the only two pictures that I have here. By the way, I should point out, even though I myself, I don't like to tie myself to any perspective. I actually think the 40-day thing is actually not bad. If you think, to my mind, to say that this is a mudgha, and I know people like to make fun of it. If you go online, there are all these web pages where people, have like a piece of gum and they'll make it into a funny shape and say, look, the Quran predicted this. People make fun of, apologists who speak of this. But I have to say, actually, I don't have a problem with the 40-day interpretation. But to go to your question, if you look at the top picture there, that's around day 120. And I don't have a picture for day 80, but, it would be, you have at this point, a fetus with hands and arms, and so to say that that's a mudgha, one could go that route certainly, I suppose. But I haven't seen anyone actually do it day by day and really get into that. Usually people they resort to this image, which is problematic in some ways, but it's a bit simplistic. But that's what people have sort of resorted to. I haven't come across anyone who's gone a different route. So
I would like to know the conditions under which that piece of gum.
Yeah, I mean that's a very specific bite.
Is this just some random wad of gum? I mean, that would lend more credibility.
Right, someone falling down the street and.
The implications of the discussion, like on the one hand, I see that there's a relevance in the discussion of abortion.
Yes.
And so on and so forth, but also on the other end of life issues. When does that separation occur? I know Chris and I were looking through the literature. We found essays by Ibn al-Qayyim saying that there's some kind of physicality to the soul.
Yes.
And so it's measurable, it's tangible. I mean, we're actually quite surprised that you can actually fit that division. And so that's on either end of the spectrum of life, there's implications. But what I'm even more curious about is that while we're alive, if someone can identify that thing that connects the human being to this other thing,
right? Because
there's huge implications to neuroscience actually in trying to explore that interface.
Absolutely, and I think here's where a literal reading of the Quran and the Hadiths, one has to be careful here, because if one adopts a literal reading, then you could end up with a kind of, Cartesian dualism, right? I mean, the ghost in the machine. One could end up with these kinds of ideas, and these ideas are, they seem problematic to some extent. Not that I find the alternative that's promoted today all that compelling either. But yeah, so I mean, here's where I think if one reads these literally, the soul being breathed into the body, the physical body, now, I mean, does it then form a connection with the body? I mean, this gets complicated. So if you read it literally, it gets complicated. Yeah.